The Xeno video game series has a very complicated and interesting story in both the real world and in the games. And in the story of the Xeno series as a whole, there's been many debates over what is true and what is even connected. And all of this really comes down to basically the end of Xenogears, where it said it's the end of episode 5. Sometime after the game released, an art book was released called Perfect Works. This art book gave us a glimpse of the full story that the creators of the Xeno series was trying to tell. Unfortunately, we never got sequels or prequels to Xenogears, but over time, I and many other people personally think we probably did through Xenogears' spiritual successors, which are Xenosaga and Xenoblade. This is going to be a two-part video essay where I look into the Perfect Works story outline and how I and many fans feel like the other two games in the series are basically retellings of the Perfect Works story. Though in the case of Xenosaga, it's probably basically an official unofficial prequel to Xenogears, but we'll get to that later. So this first part we will tackle the Perfect Works story and how I personally feel like the other Xeno games tells that story. Big disclaimer, this is just how I and many other fans see the story. I'm aware that many fans don't see the Perfect Work story outlines in any other Xeno games, but for me and many other fans, it's very clearly there. Many fans would even say that the creators of the Xeno series would also not go out of their way to try and retell the same story over and over again. But honestly, given how passionate the creators of the series, which is Tatsuya Takahashi and his wife Karoi Tanaka, were with telling the story since the very beginning anyway, and basically how they had tried to tell the story so many times before Xenoblade, but weren't really able to fully tell it and also not able to freely tell it. It does make sense that they would try to give it another chance, especially when this time they're literally being given the freedom to do so. Again, if you don't know the story of the creation of Xenogears, it was very complicated. They had tried, even before Xenogears was a thing, they had been trying to tell the same story. So I and many other fans do definitely think it does make sense that they would try to retell the story. Also, I know that many fans will say, but Xenoblade 1 didn't even start out as a Xeno game, it was just given the title by Iwata, the president of Nintendo at the time, to honor Takahashi's previous works. And that is true, but that doesn't mean that the foundations weren't still there before the name change. And also later on, when the name was changed, they did end up adding more Xeno-related things near the end of development. So basically, having now replayed the Xenoblade games and having played Xenogears and Xenosaga for the first time, I can even definitely say that Xenoblade 1 is basically a remake or reboot of Xenogears. They're very similar in many ways, but again, also pretty different because of Xenoblade 1's development, but the foundation is still there. Again, this will be a two-part essay. The first one is on the Perfect Work story and how each games relate to it, while the second part will be about the similarities between each Xeno game and how for me and many others, the Xenoblade games, and to an extension Xenosaga, are a reboot or retellings of the original Perfect Work sagas. Which means, again, this is not the exact same story, but it does share the main plot outlines. So when I say in this game, Xenoblade or Xenosaga belongs in this part of Perfect Works, keep in mind I mean the main plot and main idea of the outline that we were presented, not necessarily that the world of not necessarily that it's in the world of Xenogears. Again, I see this as a remake or retelling or reboot of the Perfect Work story using the outline that we were presented, but of course with each game having its own elements and its own things as well. With all that said, there's going to be a lot of spoilers below, so with all that said, let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is the Perfect Works timeline. So this is the timeline of the original vision of the story, a 6-part epic spanning thousands of years, and each part except part 6 is given a good amount of information on what it's about. So first, let's see real quick where each game falls into the Perfect Works outline, and with the most important and biggest part, which would be Xenogears. So this is the original game we got, and it covers part 5 of the Perfect Works outline, and that is what it says at the end of the game and also in the actual Perfect Works book. Now, Xenosaga episodes 1, 2, and 3, for me, they retell, but at the same time, not just retell, but actually show the original parts 1, 2, and 3 of the Perfect Works saga or outline, but in a very mixed and blended format. Not directly what it's listed there, just in a mix of the three parts together. So big, but again, it for me, even though it goes 1, 2, and 3, it still mostly retells parts 1 and 2 with very little bit of episode 3 of part 3. Now, disclaimer, Xenosaga is one that many fans don't really agree on which part it covers. Some say it's just part 1, some say it's part 1 and 2. But again, having just played them, for me, they cover what I just said. Mostly parts 1 and 2 with a little bit of part 3 and kind of all mixed together. And Xenosaga, as I mentioned earlier, is a unofficial / official prequel to Xenogears, unlike Xenoblade, but that's a little bit more complicated, but that's why I'm saying it kinda does already show parts 1, 2, and 3 in a way. Now, Xenoblade 1 basically retells part 5 of the Perfect Works story. As I said earlier, it's basically almost identical to Xenogears in many ways, but more of that's going to be around in the second video essay that I'll be doing. Now, Xenoblade X, for me, that is kind of like Xenosaga, where it retells parts 1, 2, and 3 of the Perfect Works saga, but in a mixed and blended format, again, just like Xenosaga. Now, Xenoblade 2, for me, does also retell part 5 of the story, but with a few faint blends of part 3 and 4 mixed into it, as well as some better insight into part 1. Now, Xenoblade 2, Torn of the Golden Country, this one very clearly straight out retells part 4 of the Perfect Works story. Now, for Xenoblade Future Connected, technically it can be seen as the end of part 5, so the epilogue to part 5, but it can also be seen as the prologue to part 6, or maybe even the very beginning of part 6. But at the same time, Xenoblade 3 seems to be the entire part 6 of the Perfect Works story, and this would be the first time we are getting part 6 told to us in any way other than that short description of what it would be about, and that description itself was already really vague to begin with. Now let's get into the explanation as to why these games are retelling these parts, but first I just wanted to say that as stated at the start of this video, Xenogears was only part 5. It is very clearly stated in the game and in the book it's part 5. But keep in mind, Xenosaga is a bit hard to explain as it's technically a prequel to Xenogears, but without being an official prequel due to licensing issues. But it was created by the same team, including Takahashi and his wife. Though since it was not released by Square, they couldn't technically call it a prequel. So they had to change the name and some other things, but either way, it still basically tells the story of parts 1 through 3 in a mixed way and can somewhat tie into Xenogears, but can tie into its own version of the story as well. Again, it's a bit complicated with Xenosaga, but it is important to know this due to the following explanations. So what does each part of Perfect Works outline, and why does each of these games fit there? Well, okay, so Perfect Works Episode 1 says that humans leave Earth and find a hospitable planet, and they had wars in their new planet, and these wars kept going on in space, and the Deus system was developed. That is very similar to Xenoblade X, where we see in the opening movie, right before the Conduit or Zohar's experiment, which I'm gonna call it that, what destroys the planet. A lot of people don't say it's the Zohar, but I believe it is. So right before the Zohar's experiment, or the Conduit's experiment, the planet Earth is a war-filled planet that this war basically spreads throughout the galaxy, and so humans leave the planet with the help of aliens to find a different hospitable planet, but there the wars continue. So that sounds very identical to part 1 of the Perfect Works story. And this is also very similar to Xenosaga 1, where humans are in space after there was a great war on Earth and they left Earth, found a new planet, and their wars continue on space, but they also found a way to communicate with Udu, which has connections to the Dia system. Now, Perfect Works Episode 2 says it's the start of the church and the events that revolve around them, basically trying to use the Dia system for their own gains. This is very similar to Xenosaga 2 and 3, where we see the beginnings of the church and the person behind them trying to control Uru for their own gains, and the consequences that come from trying to attack Uru. And this is also very similar to Xenoblade X, where we do see a group trying to establish their ideologies and control the power of Planet Mirror. Perfect Works Episode 3 says that human intelligence reached its peak, but people eventually can't have kids due to genetic damage, and so they began trying to create artificial humans. That is also very similar to Xenoblade X, as humans can no longer have kids due to the events in the story, which I'm not going to get into because that's going to be a lot of spoilers, and they ended up having to create MIMs, using the aid and advanced technology that the aliens gave them. Now, in Xenosaga episodes 1 through 3, they have begun already to create artificial humans for many reasons. One big one is to prolong life, to have also disposable soldiers, and those are called realians, and to carry on the essence of long dead people. Now, Perfect Works Episode 4 says that it's set 500 years before the main plot of Xenogears, and there's a conflict with the church and humanity, with the church trying to control humanity, but people now use ether and start a war against the church, and this leads to a small country no longer existing. This is literally the exact plot for Xenoblade 2 Turn of the Golden Country. Xenoblade 2 Turn of the Golden Country is set 500 years before Xenoblade 2 and is about the conflict between the humans and the church and the Aegis, and it ends with Torna, a country that ends up no longer existing at the end of the war but did during it. Perfect Works Episode 5 says the god of the world has awakened and the boy shows up in a village with no memory of his past and must set out with his friends to put an end to this false god. That is exactly like Xenoblade 1 and 2 in many ways. In these two games, a boy is brought and raised in a village with no memories of their past or where they came from and set out on a quest to bring them to defeating a false god. Perfect Works Episode 6 says it's a pivotal part in the timeline and world, but it is a yet undeveloped episode that is set sometime directly after Episode 5, and it will reveal important information that was held back and is set in a world without a god. Now, that doesn't give us much, but it does seem to resemble Xenoblade Future Connected, as that game begins to show us a time right after Xenoblade 1 with a time jump of a year ahead, and how a godless world is beginning to take effect. But it does seem to relate more to Xenoblade 3, where in Xenoblade 3, it's set a few hundred years later, and the world and dimensions have begun blending together, and there are some things that was hidden, and we are going to be getting more information on it, such as the true villain and what is going on with the universe. And again, it's showing a universe without a god. With all this said, I hope it's clear how these games do share very similar concepts and ideas to the original outlines of Perfect Works, and why I and many others feel like the Xeno games after Xenogears is a retelling or reimagining of that original story. These are just too big of a similarity to be considered just regular JRPG tropes, especially since all of these games are made by the same person who had not been able to tell the story fully before. And all of this will be further proven in the second part, where we talk about many of the very similar things and plot situations across the games. In the end, I'm happy we're finally getting this story fully told in a way through Xenoblade, as this is the first time we've been able to see and play through most of these parts basically. Now let's just head over to the second essay so we can see how identical these games truly are outside of the main plot outlines. With all that said, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll talk to you guys later.